Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Kevin, can you hear me? Yes. Okay, good afternoon. I'm here to introduce Dr. Jama Adams. Dr. Adams is a clinical psychologist and an associate professor of psychology in the Department of Africana Studies at John Jay College in the City University of New York. Dr. Adams was born in Liverpool in the UK, a former slave port of Jamaican and Somali parents. He grew up in the UK, Jamaica, and Guyana. His university education was attained in the United States, where he has resided for most of his adult life. Dr. Adams received his PhD in clinical psychology at the City University of New York and has spent his career in New York City. In addition to working as an associate professor at John Jay, some of his prior clinical experience includes positions of a senior psychologist at Harlem Hospital and the Sheltering Arms Children's Service in New York. He also was a consulting organizational and management psychologist for a variety of organizations with a focus on management, coaching, and clinical administration. Dr. Adams was a visiting associate professor of psychology at the Institute of Psychology at Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia for multiple summers, where he was involved in curriculum reform with a focus on facilitating the development and inclusion of indigenous materials in the graduate curriculum. Dr. Adams has extensive experience working with children and adults from communities of color. He has published and presented extensively in areas that include Africana migration, Black masculinities, and Black fatherhood. He was also part of a video by Black Psychoanalysts Speak, which I encourage you all to watch, and from which I was inspired to ask Dr. Adams to present at our grand rounds. Just a reminder, please, to chat any questions that you have for the discussion at the end of the grand rounds in the chat feature above. And also, if you want to email or text me, that will work as well for any questions that you might have after the grand rounds. And to claim your CME credits, there is a slide that was put up at the beginning, will be put up at the end, but email the continuing ed at hhchealth.org with your name, email, and the event that you attended in order to claim those credits. And with that, I welcome you, Dr. Adams, to begin your grand rounds titled Psychosocial Factors That Influence Mental Health Treatment Outcomes for Persons of Color. Thank you for being with us here today.
Thank you for inviting me. These are very stressful times we are living in. The combination of the COVID-19 virus, the social disruptions we've been having around justice, the food insecurity, the rent insecurity, all of these are pressuring us in perhaps not new ways, but in ways that we are now much more aware of. I remind you, however, that we have a history of responding to viruses going back 1,500 years to the 500s. And something's become clear is that those who are thoughtful, those who are calm, and those who are well resourced tend to get through this. So make sure you're taking care of yourself and staying calm and thoughtful. First of all, I'm going to talk about the presentation is divided into three parts: microsocial factors, institutional factors, and good enough interventions. And I'm going to put out a lot of ideas. So this is going to be broad and maybe a little abstract at times because, I'm a university professor. But I really hope you will have questions so that we can tease out some of this. This is not a color by the numbers prescription of how to fix your facility. That would be sort of a little bit too much hubris on my part. But I think if you take what I'm saying and then you sit down in your groups and in your conferences and you work some of this, you may find it useful. First, I'm going to talk with capitalism and Black bodies. When we speak of capitalism, we're talking about a system whose primary objective is really the generation of more capital. And it will do that by any means necessary. It can do that in ethical and it can do that in unethical ways. Capitalism is amoral. How we use it is a function of our own issues, but capitalism in of itself is morally neutral. And what we've seen it done with regards to black bodies is they were constructed as property, meaning they were a commodity that could be used to generate profit. And there was no regard, I shouldn't say there was no regard for their humanity. Their humanity as human beings, just as a basic, you're a human being and entitled to certain rights and privileges, was not acknowledged. Their humanity in terms of their capacity to be productive and creative, that was very much acknowledged in terms of its exploitation. Okay? But one of the interesting things about capitalism is that because the goal is to make money, to generate profit, it will generate some interesting constraints on the practice of how it does that. I'll give you two examples from history. In the Middle Passage, moving enslaved people, from the west coast of Africa to the Caribbean, remember the objective was profit. So what they would often do, they would stop off Barbados. Barbados is the closest Caribbean island to Africa. And they would do an assessment. And they would decide who should live and who should die based on their weight and their health. And those who were not considered viable goods were oftentimes thrown overboard, and then the sharks would wait and eat them. But the constraint is they realized we can't kill everybody. We can't brutalize everybody, otherwise we're not going to make any profit. So that was a constraint. Another interesting constraint you see, and this plays itself out today, was the issue of the technically skilled black person, in that one had to be careful how one oppressed them, given that they were critical to your supply chain, they were critical to generating profit. So how that works out in the 21st century is we see an increased search for black talent because of the diversity and the skills it brings. Be very clear, this is not an embracement of blackness as blackness. This is like, oh, they're talented, oh, they're skills, let's get them in. Oftentimes, we'll talk about this later, not to the point where they're too disruptive. I mean, they must know their place, they must fit in, and they must enhance whatever extant system we have in place. So you want to play that out in your organization in terms of those who are other. How is their otherness privilege? What aspects do you privilege? What aspects do you ignore? Okay. What capitalism also does, and you're seeing this enacted in your facility, is what we call state capture, where ideally the state, the regulators especially, are there to protect the vulnerable. The state is supposed to educate, it's supposed to nurture. But what has happened in many areas, and nursing homes are a classic example of this, is that the capitalists have captured the state in terms of the regulators. So the regulators are not in force, so the capitalists can make more money. The consequence of state capture is that those who are vulnerable are not protected. So it's not surprising that the low-income whites and blacks, people of color, nursing home residents have suffered disproportionately from COVID, because the protective functions of the states have sort of been cut off at the knees. It's all about profit. And there's tons of stuff out there where you can read how this has been done in various industries. Okay? So what we have is less equality of opportunity for the vulnerable. And this historically has been the case for blacks. And you may want to take a look at Amartya Sen, Amartyasen's work. And in 10 seconds or less, this is what Sen says. One, you have to have resources, okay? And you have to have opportunity to access those resources. And these resources give you skills And those skills give you capabilities, and that capability gives you agency, freedom, the power to act. Now, the lesser the quality of resources you have, the less skills, the lower the quality of skills, the lower the quality of capabilities, and therefore the less agency you have. And if you look around you, you will see in institutions that persons of color and certain classes of women are less skilled and therefore have less capabilities and therefore have less autonomy, the income and all the things that go with that. I'll give you a very quick example how this works. When you go to school, you take your little princess to school at 3. The school preschool focuses on skills. Okay, line up, wait until the food gets to you, don't climb on the table, don't bite, social skills, ABC, 1, 2, 3. When you get to first grade, the skill demands increase because there you're taught to read, you're taught to count. And when you get to third grade, you now have to use those skills to develop capabilities, which is you're no longer learning to read in a basic way. You're now taking the reading and learning with it. Now you can see that if you didn't get the right resources at pre-K through grade 1, you're in trouble. You don't have the readiness skills and you start falling behind and you keep falling behind. So poor skills, poor capabilities, limited autonomy. And we see that being played out in the culture, okay? The other thing that happens is when we talk about equality of opportunity, we're not just talking about tangible technical skills, which is what capitalism stresses. We're also talking about rights and privileges, respect, protection, accountability. And we see again and again that when you look in low-income communities and in communities of color, especially, you see rights, the opportunity to having rights respected is less. You can be shot sleeping in your bed. Okay. You go to school and you find a disproportionate of your children are in special ed, and the appeals process is against you if there is even an appeals process. So one of the things we always have to pay attention to is not just giving people tangible opportunities. We also have to see is, are rights respected? Because the two get related. The two are related. If we respect rights, if we respect privileges in an ethical way, then people have greater access to resources. So in your facility, there are CNAs, there are people low on the professional rung. And it's interesting whether, the Human Resources Department has a pipeline for those people to move up the ladder in order to give them the opportunity to become nurses, to become whatever the next step is on that scaffolding, and it is there, okay? Those scaffoldings have oftentimes been captured by the middle class, and it's oftentimes not easy for low-income persons to access them, okay? This creates, in the elites, a lot of ambivalence and paradox. One of the major challenges that the elites face in dealing with persons of color historically was acknowledging their humanity. And this challenge came about because, the United States is in some ways, and we don't have time to go into how, but the United States is one of the most God-fearing societies in the world, as measured by church attendance and that we believe in God, etc., etc. So the dilemma they face is, well, how could you have enslaved peoples when the Bible says no? Now, remember here, capitalism is always there. The need for profit is always there. And we know historically and contemporarily that when capitalism meets ethics, when capitalism meets religion, invariably capitalism wins. It's very adroit, it's very nuanced in how it does this. So I'll give you a quick example. Amazon has a reputation of not treating their workers well in the pursuit of profit. So what does Mr. Bezos do? He gets up and he gives away $100 million. And it's like, how nice, how nice, how nice. But the system has not changed. Capitalism wins. So the dilemma was, how can we have enslaved persons and says we're God-fearing Christians? So the solution to that dilemma, which was intellectually very adroit, if ethically disingenuous, was to say, well, they're human, but they're not quite as human as we are. What you had was the famous chain of beings argument, chain of beings, where there was a hierarchy of ethnic groups, and of course whites were at the top. But this wasn't a pipeline. This was essentialist. The whites were at the top. The whites would always be at the top because the blacks and the other groups lacked the inherent capabilities to get to the top. They would never get there, okay? And that created a problem because remember, we're God-fearing creatures. So we have an obligation to these people. And Rudyard Kipling came up with the idea of white man's burden. Now, he was talking about what the Americans were doing in the Philippines. And, you know, we have our own little colonial history, but that's another lecture. And the argument was there, well, given that they are inferior, they don't have what it takes, we have an obligation to take care of them. And one of the risks you face in your facility and in your institutions is that in making interventions, you will act from a position of the white man's burden, that you have to take care of the people of color, that you've got to take care of the cleaners and whatnot, because they really can't take care of themselves in the ways that they should. We'll talk a little about that later. Okay. You may also want to look at, it's widely available on the web, an article by Walker. Oh, why am I forgetting the name of the article? It'll come back to me. Where he addresses the failure of white folks to live up to their elite pretensions around religion and principles. Okay. The other thing that happens psychologically that we do as elites, and that certainly white elites did to blacks, men do it to women, is we project into them. We project into the other, the disavowed other, those aspects of ourselves that we cannot accept because we're God-fearing, ethical creatures, we say. So sexuality. The enslaved woman is raped because she's wanton. We're very, very familiar with that, that kind of thinking. The man is beaten because he's aggressive. And they're ungrateful for what we are doing for them. And you hear that being acted out today. We see the aggression where no matter what people of color do to express their concerns, to express their pain, it is still considered inappropriately aggressive. So there was Copernic taking a knee. I don't know what's less aggressive than that. And he was condemned. And the people who are condemning him, I know the same ones who are like, oh, the marches, the riots, they're condemning that. So the question then arises, what kind of aggression is acceptable by persons talking about their dehumanization? And that plays itself out over and over and over again in mental health facilities. We have this, some people have this strange notion that clients come in vulnerable and hurting. They should behave, they should be nice, they should be polite, and call security. And it's like, hold a second, you know, I go to the emergency room, you know, I cut off my toe, and you're gonna complain that I'm bleeding? So we gotta pay attention to how those projections get enacted in your institution. The larger issue, and if you remember anything about this lecture, try to remember this particular piece, is the cultural tension between an exceptionalism seen at its height in American society around individual autonomy, individual agency. The idea that, you know, we can do it by ourselves as persons. We are truly, truly ambivalent about interdependency. But that is a species quality. That's not particular to the United States. But it's probably most heightened here when we hear, pull yourself up by your bootstraps, oftentimes by people who were embedded in the richest of networks that got them to where they are. He who cannot be named went to a certain university, got people to take his exams, got people to squash his lawsuits, and then speaks about, the need to be independent, the need to be autonomy. So if there's one thing we have to pay attention to, is this overvaluing of independence rather than healthy, developmentally appropriate interdependence. What is appropriate to expect of this person at that particular age? A quick amusing aside is, I've noticed this, that a lot of preschoolers, when they're going to school and they're going home, the parent carries the bag. And I'm applying for a certain research grant to figure out what is it that those preschoolers have in that bag, why the parent has to carry the bag back and forth. And as soon as they walk in the door, the teachers are very clear. You can take off your coat. You can hook up your coat when we're going to the playground, and kids have really interesting strategies on how to do that. Here's the point. They are expected to demonstrate age-appropriate autonomy, but there's a lot of help. There's a lot of support. They're not left on their own. Okay? So here is the core idea. That as humans, we, you go to a little Freudian thing there, we are very pleasure-oriented. We don't do well with frustration. We have a long period where our imagination has to be tutored so we can be appropriate. And we resent that because tutoring imagination puts constraints on your ability to act out and pursue pleasure. To be civilized, you're going to have to be frustrated. So we're always ambivalent about having to rely on others. We want, but we don't necessarily want to give, and we don't want to necessarily accept the limits. So what I'm saying here is the way we defend against that helplessness is by having illusions of omnipotence. I don't need this. I can do this on my own. I don't need anyone. But in the meantime, we are having our interdependencies addressed, but we don't acknowledge that we need others. And you see that being enacted with persons of color who are expected to be autonomous and independent in ways which are not only unhealthy, but remotely not possible, given that they don't have the resources that they need to do this. So I'll give you an example from New York City. We have a tragedy, or a travesty, I think it's a travesty, where we have these specialized high schools. Bronx, Science, Stuyvesant are the two that come to mind. They're STEM schools. Maybe they're STEAM, but they're STEM schools. And they have an exam to take in students because they have limited capacity. I think they're taking around 700 students a year at each one of them. And on average, they take in maybe 10, 12 students of color. It's not above 20. And what you hear is, well, if the kids were good enough, they would get in. In other words, stop all this talk about race, da-da-da-da-da. What the research shows is the kids who are in schools that are taking this exam. So I think it's maybe a 6th or 7th grade exam. They are not taught the material on the exam. So let's say there is trigonometry, and you have your little Jose, and you have your little Shanika. They're bright, but nobody has taught them trigonometry. So they're not going to do well on the test. So here again, you see the resource issue, that what is an issue of equality of opportunity becomes transformed into that essentialist argument, that chain of being argument, the blacks, the Latinos are just not good enough. And sometimes they say it more discreetly. They say, well, it's because of poverty. Look at the Asians. Well, I had an Asian kid in one of my classes. And he explained to me, he says, listen, professor, I got to leave early on Fridays because I got to go home and coach my brother. I said, coach him for what? He said, the Stuyvesant test. He said, we've got the books, and in his school, they don't teach him trigonometry. So I have to teach him, and my community has a group that teaches him. So they're able to marshal resources. Now, here you see, again, the retreat of the state. You're paying tax dollars for the state to teach kids trigonometry and carry your bag and put on your coat, and it's not happening. Okay? And then you say, oh, these people are just not bright enough. Be careful of how that gets enacted in your treatment programs, where you have expectations, subtle, cultural, unconscious expectations of clients that may not be justified, and how you address that. Okay? So let's talk about institutional practices. You are not gods. You are average human beings. In some areas, some of us are above average. In other areas, we're below average, but you're not gods. So many of us enact the biases of the culture that we grew up in. Remember when we went back to, we talked about tutoring imagination. Okay, we grew up used to seeing the person of color in an inferior position. Okay, we're used to seeing them not do well on exams. Okay, we're used to seeing them being arrested. And we're also used to not having to interrogate, why is this happening? Because what has been infused into our imagination is the idea that they are lesser than. That's the default. So a friend of mine put it this way. He says, for many years, he realized that his dreams were in black and white. And I'm still trying to figure out, do I dream in color or black and white? But his point was, he just accepted that, his dreams are in black and white and everything is black and white. And many of us take in the this negative other and we make it the norm. All of us do this. Many years ago, I was watching a documentary on Mars. And the NASA Mars coordinator was speaking off camera, and his name was on the screen. You could hear his voice, and you could see his name, but you couldn't see him. So I saw this name, which as an English speaker was unpronounceable to me. And I said, oh, some white guy from Central Europe. Well, then his face came on, and he was a black man, and I Googled, and he was from Mali. My default when I hear a scientific expert must be a white person, which of course is not always the case. Okay? So we've got to be in touch with how we enact this negative other that we have internalized, because it affects our theory, it affects our theorizing, and it affects our practice in terms of how we engage patients, how we engage each other, who we cut off, who we listen to, who we consider experts. Okay. One of the consequences is that the institutions that are predominantly seeing persons of color tend to be under-resourced, and that's been a historical record. Okay. And that goes back to separate and unequal and using the books that others didn't want. Okay. So your resources, your resource challenges, which are probably tied to state funding, means you're not getting the resources you have because other places are getting more of those resources. And we certainly know that one of the accountings that our governor in New York State has to come up to speak to is why public facilities, Elmhurst Hospital, Downstate Hospital, were so underfunded and unprepared to deal with the crisis. Whereas you have your NYUs and your Presbyterians, which were doing fine. Okay, and of course you see how institutionally the inequalities replicate themselves because those institutions are rich. They see rich patients, they get endowments, and they continue getting richer. They do a fantastic job, but the downstates, the Elmhursts, don't have the resources. So when you're in a situation of resource insufficiency, I'm saying it oftentimes maps onto the population that you are seeing. Okay. You also, something you need to pay attention to in your institutional practices is you are disconnected from history. You're disconnected from community. These clients come in and you really don't know their cultural history. You really don't know the communities that they come from. What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses in those communities? What you're tasked to do as mental health institutions increasingly is to maintain surveillance and monitoring. You're very good at that. We're very good at testing and diagnosing and classifying and constraining. We're not so good at the humanistic interventions because we don't have the resources to do that. Within your facility, you have some really good ideas, but do you have the political resources? Are there the opportunities to enact them? Are the structures in place by which you can do that? And the chances are, I'm suggesting, you're getting a lot of resources to monitor, to assess, and to pacify. The idea of taking people and making them better in a larger humanistic sense is a larger struggle field. So what you find yourself in is a culture of docility. You're in a culture of docility where your task is to have the client adapt to a crazy culture. And the more the client resists adapting to the crazy culture, the crazier the client is diagnosed as, and the more force is brought to them from psychopharmacological force, restraints force, intensive therapy force, that he must adapt to the culture. Because our notion of mental illness tends to be one where any attempt to challenge the extent becomes defined as something is wrong with this person. Now, oftentimes we're doing that unconsciously. The person is raging and our focus is, yeah, we hear the associations, but they're hallucinatory. Let us calm him down, and they disappear. Or we don't hear them anymore. Okay? So ask yourself the role you play in being invested in that your task is to make sure that this person can function in the extant system. Now, I know we have to live with frustration, but sometimes we forget it's crazy out there. It's troubling out there. A man is walking down the street, hallucinating, and ends up dead because the police say, oh, he's crazy. He's disturbing the peace. He's going to hurt us. And we have the strategies to do that. But no, even if you're mentally ill, you should fit in with the normative culture. If not, you are at risk for some kind of state-sanctioned intervention that may not be in your best interest. And this is not just the police. This happens in mental health facilities. Okay? So we're saying that mental illness has a component of it where we are saying it is the resistance to what we consider the norm. And I'm saying you need to consider what that norm is and how much of that mental illness can be rethought in a way in the service of growth, humanization. The other thing we do is we over-police the irrational. We over-police the irrational. Okay. Capitalism exploits it. There's a book you should read by a guy called Todd McGowan. Todd McGowan. And the name of the book is Capitalism and Desire. Capitalism and Desire. And what he says in that book, the short version, is that in a capitalist culture, the imagination is tutored to feel that desire can be fully assuaged. If you just consume the right things and you consume more of those things, desire will be assuaged. Of course, some of us on a good day have discovered that desire cannot be fully assuaged. So what happens is capitalism gives you a product. Take the classic example, your iPhone. And it gives you an iPhone 9, and it says it will solve all of your telecommunication problems. It will transport you to a higher level of communications heaven. Of course, it doesn't. So the gratification quickly wears off, and you start hungering for iPhone 11. And you hunger and you hunger, and you get it, and then you realize it doesn't quite do what I need. And that continues infinitely. So McGowan is saying you have to embrace the paradox of satisfaction. And the paradox of satisfaction is that within the context of dissatisfaction, you have to be satisfied. You have to accept that I will never be fully satisfied, but that within my dissatisfaction, there is some satisfaction that you can have. So last week, and you can find this in the New York Times, Chris Rock had a fascinating interview. And I don't know what it says about our culture that some of our most prominent social commentators are comedians, but that's another lecture. And one of the arguments he was making was that he was speaking to dissatisfaction. And he was saying, I think the example he used is that if a woman is being beaten by her partner and the partner stops beating her, that is not a situation of joy, that she should be happy she is not being beaten. And I can be sympathetic with that on an individual level. But the challenge we face is the reason why that beating may not be going on is because of victories won in the past. The culture's halting progress in saying violence is not acceptable. And what McGowan is saying is you got to hold those things in tension. That you have to accept, listen, this hitting, this beating, this oppression of people is not acceptable. And Rock is saying, but don't ask me to be grateful because the oppression has eased up. So there's some room to say, okay, we've made some progress, but it's not a place you can stay for very long. And managing that tension, some progress has been made, but also dissatisfaction at the work that still needs to be done is a tension that we have to pay attention to in our culture. So we need to celebrate victories in the context of realizing we still have a way to go, and probably will always have a way to go. Okay? So when we over-police the irrational, we again come back to you must be rational and logical in the ways that are acceptable to the culture. And one of the things that mental health facilities have a possibility of monitoring and working with is productive regressions. Okay? One can think of a regression as an attempt to rework helplessness and omnipotence. Okay? So all of us here have our comfort food. All of us here have our comfort TV programs. All of us have areas in which we regress to feel comfortable, to feel safe, or to rework something. But the potential of a mental health facility is that when we do the regression in a safe space, we can do the work so we don't probably need to regress in that way in the future. And we have to be careful we're not punishing the regression. Oh, he's yelling. Oh, he said he wants to fuck me. But what's that about? What is he really trying to get across to you? One of the ideas you may want to think about is the difference between the womb and the breast. The regression to the womb is a regression back to what you may want to consider the ultimate happy meal. In the womb, you're floating in a controlled environment. The temperature is set. The food is fed to you. You shit when you want to shit. Life is just perfect. And then you get expelled from the womb. Your Eden is lost. And you're presented with the breast. The breast is nurturing, but you have to suck. Mommy cannot suck for you. The breast requires work. And Toni Morrison has a scene in one of her many works where two women are talking. And one says to the other, if I allowed my adult son, I mean, this is not the actual language, but this is the spirit of it, he would crawl back into the womb. So my point here is, think of how you're working the regressions. They want the womb. Are we offering a good breast? Something to think about how you go about setting up your clinical work, your clinical situation. Talk a little bit more about that in a second. Which means then that if we are determined to stamp out the irrational, the unproductive irrational, if we're determined to stamp out regression, then pharmaceuticals, CBT, they become very attractive in the policing of the mind in a way that, yeah, you can mark off, whatever the insurance company is going to pay it for in terms of outcomes as attained, but have you really addressed the entire person? Okay. So enough of the despair. The last point on despair is there's a concept I read about recently called John Henryson. And John Henry was a mythical black worker on the railroads who his job was to drive spikes. And capitalism has always come up with a new way, a more efficient way to make money. So they came up with a machine that drove spikes. And John Henry, the big black man, the black body, showed that I can do it faster than the machine. He beat the machine by drilling more spikes into the ground than the machine, and then collapsed from a heart attack. You've got to be careful of John Henryism, not just in your behaviors, because one, it doesn't lead to systemic change, and two, you're fueling the omnipotence, that if I just tried harder, if the client just tried harder, they would be able to achieve what it is they're achieving. And some people have argued that one of the reasons why hypertension is so high in the black community is because of John Henryism. The idea that you're just not trying hard enough. Okay? Let's talk about interventions. The first thing that you have to do institutionally and individually is to take a hard look at the idea of where you fall on the helplessness, omnipotence continuum. How do you work the conflict presented? It's an existential conflict. Okay, it's an existential conflict, which culture, of course, can ameliorate or make worse. Okay, so it's part of your predisposition. You see babies, they don't want the green goo, they spit it out, they want the blue goo. And it's a futile fight. They're saying, listen, this is what I want. But you realize the green goo is good for them, so you got to find a creative way to get it into them. Okay? Your 3-year-old comes to you and says, I hate the math teacher, I'm not going back to math class. And you got to find a way to say, you know what? We need to work this. And you try to figure out, well, what's going on in that class, blah, 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 blah. Okay? So that tension between helplessness and omnipotence cannot be eliminated. Sorry. It can be managed, but it can't be eliminated. Okay? And what we all struggle with is the fear of failure. Okay? Now, remember again the failure of the state. Many of us are not protected. So we're terrified we will lose our job. We will lose our status. And therefore, we ramp up on omnipotence and on controlling if we have that authority, which, of course, can just feed the helplessness. Okay? And what can sometimes happen is that we overprivilege technique. If I can just figure out this technique, I'll be in control. I can do this. And we overprivilege command. Okay? What we tend to not do is we don't see ourselves in the other. When the clients come in, we don't always see, well, how does my helplessness resonate with their helplessness? And if we have the strength and the support to see the commonalities, then paradoxically, we can manage that continuum better. I had a client who came in and he says, "You look tired." I was tired. And I say, "It's been a rough day." He said, "Man, you need to use some ganja. You need some marijuana." I said, "Tell me about what marijuana does for you." And he spoke about the calming, the reverie, the ability to be in touch with more positive aspects of himself. No, I didn't call my local drug dealer and order some marijuana. But what I took from that conversation is there are ways you can be calmer. There are practices you can engage in that promote reverie, calmness, creativity. So one of the things you have to pay attention to is that in managing this helplessness, you don't see the client as the embodiment of helplessness, but maybe within their helplessness, you can learn to understand yourself, to understand them, and then to create something that that moves you more towards assertiveness, healthy, independent. Okay. That means, of course, going into the abyss of the irrational. And many of us know that sometimes you go down there and it's like, okay, we are not in Kansas, and how did we get down this rabbit hole? That's where supervision, healthy functioning helps you. But if you're too detached, if you're too married to the rational, if you're too married to the control, this is not the line of work you need to be in. You've got to go into the abyss and have support that you can come back out. Okay. Safe spaces. This work is very difficult. Okay. This work is very, very difficult. And we put on these masks and we put on these faces and we put on these ways of thinking about ourselves to protect against the helplessness. And if we're not careful, because we don't have safe spaces, we fall apart in the most inappropriate times and in the most inappropriate places. So where are the safe places? Okay. Now, safe places create a paradox. And this is a paradox. In a professional therapeutic setting, the idea of a safe place is a place to do unsafe work. Okay? Therapy is not a hug, porridge session with your mom and dad. It's not a pizza party on a Friday evening at home. It's a place where work gets done. And you need to ask yourself, are the psychological conditions in place? Are the psychosocial conditions in place where a person feels safe enough to do painful work? If the safe place becomes an echo chamber, you're heightening the helplessness. You're heightening the sense of helplessness, and therefore it's going to be rage and unproductive regression. Okay? So the last thing I want to talk about is atonement. When I say atonement, I mean 4 interrelated factors. An acknowledgement of pain caused by acts of commission and acts of omission. There are things we have done on an individual level. There are things we have done on the level of our ethnic group. There are things we've done on an institutional level that have hurt people of color, have hurt ourselves. And sometimes it's what we didn't do versus what we did do. So a classic that some of us need to atone for is silence. When we should have spoken up, we were silent. So many of us sit on listservs and we make no contribution. We do not speak out against injustice. We do not atone in any way. We are just silent, not acceptable. Okay? The second meaning of atonement is a recommitment to humanistic first principles. a recommitment to humanistic first principles. So many of us came into this work in part driven by fear of helplessness, either our own helplessness or the helplessness we saw in others. And in our ethically informed omnipotence, we want to assist. Well, in doing that assistance, it is very important that we recommit to humanistic principles, accepting people's humanity, accepting their vulnerability, rather than just seeing them as some negative other. Which means the third aspect of atonement is a reimagining of our roles and our practices. Okay? A reimagining of how we go about the work, how we think about ourselves, and how we assist others. And the fourth principle is we have to get beyond symbolic atonement. So as you can see, I'm a person of color. And I say to my white colleagues, I said, listen, you're allowed one apology for your whiteness. I don't want to hear any more apologies. That's symbolic. Yeah, you're sorry. And, maybe, you did something wrong to the checkout girl at the counter. Yeah. And you're sorry. You got to go beyond just the apology, the gnashing of teeth. Because when you leave this presentation, everybody in this room is going back to a role. And that role has some authority. And that's where the atonement work really begins. So I'm not against apologies. I'm not against pulling down statues. I'm not against changing the name of the ward from that of a racist to that of somebody who was more inclusive. But those are low-hanging fruit, and you have to do more than that. So let me talk about, in 7 minutes, substantive atonement. You have to understand the history of unearned privilege. The privileges handed down to us by other generations and built into the system to our advantages. Okay? I am 6 feet tall, I'm educated, and I'm well-spoken. Generations of people contributed to that. I won the genetic lottery. I was born to the parents I was born, not to the next door neighbor who's into drugs and don't work. I didn't earn that privilege. We have to acknowledge that. And especially if you're white, many of those privileges were built into the system for whiteness at the cost of black privilege. That all of that is unearned. And we have to acknowledge that you were lucky in some profound ways. Okay? The privilege then has to be managed. Okay? Because the way the system is now set up, the way the privilege is structured, those stepping stones for others are not there. There are stones missing. There are rungs on the ladder missing. So it's kind of like your privilege is baked into the system, and it's harder for them to come up. You want to look at your institution and see how that privileges work. So one institution found out that all of its interns were young white women. The internship was unpaid. It required 2 days a week. So it means any person of color who was low income or any low income person could not apply for that internship because they couldn't take 2 days off a week. And the institution had the resources to at least give a transportation card and lunch. It gave nothing. Okay? So, we don't have enough black persons and we don't have enough this and we don't have enough. Well, look at your system. The privilege is such that they will never get in. Okay? You have to keep a tight rein on the refusal of power. The refusal of power is a situation we now have where we have racism without racists. Because the racism is built into the system. You don't have to do anything. I was just following the protocol on intakes, and the protocol on intake says, do not ask anything about family. It may not say that, but you don't really ask about family. Like, is there any mental illness in your family? What's the strength in your family? That grandmother who brought her in, what support groups is she in? Okay, that can be of issue. We have the power to change how we do intake. But the refusal of power means we just accept that the system is the way it is and there's nothing we can do about it, even as we continue to exercise privilege, even as we continue to carry out the same unethical and unproductive ways. We say, there's nothing we can do. Whatever level you're at, there is something you can do. So enough with this refusal of power. You have power. It may not be as much as you want. Welcome back to helplessness versus omnipotence. Okay? So 4 things you can do in terms of what I call procedural atonement. Understand the legacies of intergenerational pain and strengths. There are strengths. There are strengths, and they can be uncovered and they can be worked. Okay? Understand your ethnic history. It always fascinates me when you ask some white folks about their history, they know nothing about their ethnic history. And those ethnic histories, the Irish, the Italians, the Jews, it carries tremendous amount of pain and strength, but it's not tapped into. It gets acted out in treatments, in projections, but it's not named, it's not understood. So please, folks, start knowing your history. Read Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States. That's one good place to start, okay? Last point is this. Don't expect people of color to run and embrace you because you've suddenly become woke. You've suddenly discovered your inner blackness or your inner femaleness or transgenderness. People have been oppressed, they're scared of you. Because they know you're just reading from the menu of the day. You're doing symbolic atonement. So you're going to have to show these people in substantive ways that they can trust you, that the places you have are safe for them to come into. Otherwise, they will keep their distance. They will play the same game that you're playing. Yes, the medication is working. Yes, I'm going to my therapy group. And 3 months later, they're back in the institution. I will stop there.
Thank you very much, Dr. Adams, for that presentation. I have a lot of questions. I'm going to see, I've gotten some questions too through email and text that I will ask you from other people. If anybody else has any other questions, please put in the chat feature as well. But I learned so much from your lecture today. There were so many things that you taught me that I did not know that would be helpful for me to understand the context in which I work and how to improve, what we do here at the IOL. One of the questions I did receive from my colleague here is talking about creating a safe space. So we've actually had some discussions here about safe spaces and how there may not be such a thing as a safe space. And so how do we really, if you could elaborate a little bit more on the idea of a safe space, but also how can we gauge the safety our clients feel? And what are ways typical psychotherapy approaches may actually be counteracting or inhibiting true safe spaces? It's kind of like 3-part question there.
Well, you need to be careful of group safe spaces because people come in there with different vulnerabilities, different agendas. So one of the things that capitalism makes costly in institutions is time. Okay? So the question is there the time for one-on-one encounters? Because part of what has to happen in a safe place, there must be a certain amount of venting. Okay? When I was working in Cheltenham Arms, we had intake meetings, and we had to decide which kids we were going to take and which kids, by extension, which families we were going to take and which families we were not going to take. And we would all put our stuff out there. Listen, I want a kid who is dark skin, curly hair, snotty nose, and on the spectrum. And I would fight for that kid. And people says, yeah, your problem is you don't like the cuddly, kissy, weepy ones. I said, you are so right on that. So, of course, they gave me a couple of cuddly, weepy ones. So you want a space where you can be honest, and it's safe to be honest. And sometimes our honesty, it's crazy, it's irrational. We're back to, is there a space where we can talk about irrational? And it may be a one-on-one space. It may not be a group space, because group spaces are oftentimes not yet safe enough in those ways. So in terms of technique, one of the first things I always ask clients is, what are your concerns today? And I remember a client saying, a mother, she came to me, she says, you have no interest in me as a person. You're only interested in me as a mother of this 3-year-old. I said, I'm sorry. How can I be of help to you? She says, we need a bed. I said, I know I'm here to talk about the child's behavior, but I need a bed. What is it that the client wants? Because if the client feels that you're addressing their needs, then you can get to some of the other issues that they may be scared in talking about. So be careful how you are engaging people as a function of your agenda as against their agenda.
Great advice. Thank you. And I think the context of the safe space definitely is being talked about more in group settings. So your answer makes a lot of sense in that. And I'm just curious, as a follow-up to that, and actually hearing, on Black psychoanalysts speak, in terms of safety and what people come and talk about, whether it's things that are going on in their community, like racial trauma. Someone had mentioned in that video that people come talk to therapy talking about murderous rage towards family members, and that's acceptable, but yet it's taboo to come in and talk about topics such as race and racial trauma. Can you talk a little bit to that?
Well, one of the many consequences of the regulation of the educational sector and of the tutoring and the imagination is certain topics are taboo. So now we're trying to have those conversations. It's like trying to read Russian to read Chinese text. Like, we have no idea how to have those conversations. And that's why we come back to the one-on-one, to professional staff development activities such as this, to begin to say, how can we have this discussion? What is known? There's a lot known out there on how to have these conversations. But every institution is going to have to reimagine within its climate and within its resources what's possible. Some conversations you're not ready to have. I mean, many have done work, for example, think of the equivalent work around incest in a family. You are not going to bring that entire family into a room and sit down and talk about incest. That just is not a good thing to do. So you may have to have a talk with dad if he's the perpetrator. And it may be a very oblique conversation. But the idea here is there is somebody who has some expertise who can supervise you in how to go about having that conversation. So you may have to import talent. And now let me say something that might be potentially offensive. People have realized that there's money to be made in this time of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and the racial conversation. And everybody and their mother is turning up as an expert. They've read White Fragility and they're ready to go. Be careful. Be careful in that process. Tap into your, how do I feel? And you need to be aware of your own anxieties and racism, but be careful of, professional development workshop people are coming with this is the 5 things you need to do at your institution. It's not that simple.
Yes, I agree. Thank you so much for that. So I have some comments, and I'm going to mute somebody in a minute who wants to ask a question, but just some of the comments thanking you for your fascinating presentation here. Someone else said, thanks so much. Sounds to me like refusal of power can translate to denial of accountability.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
And yes, go ahead.
Okay. Obviously, if I don't have the authority, then I'm not accountable. Like, it's a system. We are, in some important ways, the system. I'm not saying the Connecticut Department of Mental Health isn't sitting on your back and say, do this, but there's always some wiggle room. And that's where we have to control the omnipotence and says, okay, I can't do everything I want to do, but don't let the perfect be the enemy of the bad. What can we do? Can we get donuts into the meeting that the clients want as against, you got to be eating vegetables all the time? It's like, where's the power? There is some power, and we need to grasp it and use it in an ethical way.
Right. Thank you so much for that. I'm trying to unmute Patrice here. Patrice, can you unmute yourself with your question? I don't see. Kevin, can you help me unmute Patrice if you're still on? Oh, I'm finding it here, how to do it. Okay, let me, 1 second, bear with me. Just trying to find the phone here. There she is. Okay, I'm going to unmute her. Patrice, are you unmuted? Can you unmute yourself?
I'm unmuted.
Thank you. I'm going to mute myself now.
So it wasn't a question. It was just a comment which you kind of already included. I wanted to thank you for your presentation and speaking so bluntly and clearly. I think you gave voice to some of the things that I was thinking, but that I wouldn't per se say to white folks just for feeling uncomfortable and not knowing how they would perceive it or receive it or accept it. So I just wanted to say thank you for that, because I know there's, white allies on the line, and hopefully what you have said, they will take it into consideration and go from there.
Thank you, Patricia. One of the many risks we face is that because we're pleasure-seeking beings, that some of us can take pleasure in being spanked in this way, if that's what it feels like. Oh, I am bad and I'm this and I'm that. And we're all works in progress. I mean, somebody once said that the healthy human being is always in the process of becoming. We never quite get where we need to get. And it's important to, to feel some pain over things we know we have done or we benefit from. But pain and rage, think of them as airports or bus stations. It's not places you stay. You take the pain and says, how am I going to work this now to get to a healthier place where it can be more productive? So again, I come back to symbolic atonement. Yes, the apologies. Yes, I was wrong, but that's not a place to stay. You need to then say, within my authority, however defined, what can I now do?
Thank you. Another question I got here is if you could just expand a little bit more on productive regression in terms of mental health.
Okay, question, are you an inpatient or outpatient facility?
Both, all levels of care here, yes.
Okay, good. So oftentimes regression is an attempt to find a place where one feels safer. The way it's expressed you may not be in a safe space to do that. But then you can begin to have some idea of what are the early primitive underpinnings of the behavior that brought that client into your office or into the facility. And therefore, getting into that dynamic, understanding. I know a client who she's in her 80s. And the place that she constantly goes back to is being at the airport, having a temper tantrum because her mother left to go and work in another country. She's 89 and she's been having a temper tantrum for 86 years because no one has acknowledged the rawness of her pain of being left. And therefore she's organized her entire character style around raging about being abandoned, raging about not being accepted. So you got to go back with there and acknowledge that, acknowledge the pain, acknowledge the loss at that level. That client may need to be held to be able to start moving forward. Okay?
Thank you. I have another question here that I got an email I'm going to read here. Professor, very thought-provoking. Allow me to posit a contrary, somewhat mixed-up point. The problem is not with capitalism, it being amoral. The virtue of capitalism is another story that is often ignored due to the need to find an easily identified anata and divert the attention from the primary challenge. The primary challenge is humans and an inherent biological drive of pleasure and survival, omnipotence and greed. Capitalism has become a surrogate for that. Greed, or the need to maintain omnipotence, then leads to a competition for corralling resources, real and psychological. Any thoughts, since looking at it this way may give us better insight into solutions?
I thought that's what I said. Capitalism, it's a construct, it's a tool. It can be used for good and it can be used for bad. Okay? But I think that the way state capture has occurred, it's like artificial intelligence. It becomes embedded in our institutions in a way that we have given it agency through procedures. And therefore, it takes on an administrative life of its own, where we just follow those procedures and don't realize, hold a second, I don't have control anymore because I've built a system of procedures and practices which are harmful. So it does feed off greed, primitiveness, whatever. But because we've now embedded it into our institutions, and the institutions run our lives in some important ways, it is much, much harder to control. It's almost as if it has a life of its own. It doesn't. But for us to do what you're suggesting, to take it back, is extremely painful. One of the things COVID has shown us is we need to take a hard look at our supply chains. Do I really need to eat out every day? What is the cost to those undocumented persons who the only money they are making is the money I'm giving them? Do I realize that by insisting on low prices, I'm oppressing them? Those are humanistic questions, and I agree with. The challenge is, how do we change institutional practice? Because it's now built into the institution. So we now have capitalism without capitalists because the system is running it.
Thank you very much for that response. I have one person who also wants to ask about atonement. So Ralph, I'm going to unmute you right now. If you can unmute yourself and ask the last question here. Ralph, I muted you.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Okay.
We can hear you.
Dr. Adams, this is an awesome, awesome presentation. Thank you so much for your time. You talked about, the apology. I've been to that place. You've talked about atonement. You kind of said, okay, now get on with it. What's that look like? Where do I go with that? I've learned how to recognize the power that I have. Where do I go with that, doctor?
You need to make an appointment for a $900 an hour consultation for me to answer that particular question, because I don't
I'm
know
in place.
you.
Set it up.
All right. I don't know you well enough, and this is not a safe space to ask you certain kinds of questions. But tell me your rank. What do you do?
I'm right now a case man. I'm a certified addictions counselor. I'm a
Very
person
good.
in long-term recovery.
Good. Very good. I'm teaching a course to, I don't know what the term of the day is, so forgive me if I get it wrong, but to persons who are formerly, okay, no, I get it. They're justice-involved persons. Some of them have been incarcerated, some for as long as 25 years. Others have are working in that field, and many of them are doing work with people who have addiction issues. And I can tell you, and I think you know this, the temptation to rescue, the temptation to see them as helpless it's very potent, and it has to be resisted. Because you have to figure out now, what is Jama, this person coming into my room, capable of? How can I protect him? And how do I have to stand back and make sure that when he falls, yes, he will hurt himself, but he won't bounce his head? How do you manage your authority in a way that facilitates him growing while protecting him? And we need workshops and those things, because it's not easy to do it. And what we need help with is how to articulate our experience, that some of us know the minute the client walks in, some of us know, I have a sense of where she is today. I have a sense of where he is today. And your head starts going through all of these gears of, okay, that plan that I had, that treatment plan says this is week 3 and she should be at state, that goes out the door. Or, but I need to remember to adhere to first principles, which is, if I can calm that client down, maybe we can do some work that can get us back to stage 3 of the treatment plan. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, but it has a lot to do with having supervision, having support, being in touch with this powerful need to rescue, and seeing the paradox of rescue. Sometimes I need to give them space. Sometimes I need to allow the regression. Other times I have to say, absolutely not. Somebody I was supervising, and the client was on a list for housing. And I'm obviously not a fan of capitalists, but one of the rules that New York City has is that when they put up these 900 feet, 900-mile high skyscrapers and super residential buildings, they have to put in housing for low-income people. And there's a lottery. And I know I tell all of my students, I teach a lot of low-income students, get your name on that lottery. Because 10 years from now, when you're 28, 29, it might pop up to get an apartment. Anyway, this client who has a serious substance abuse problem, their name came up. Nice studio apartment, nice building, nice neighborhood. And the caseworker had a history of homelessness, bad homelessness and substance abuse. And the institution, to its credit, had a mechanism in place that the caseworker couldn't decide who got the apartment, even if their name came up. The person had to be cleared mentally. And they had a meeting where the caseworker regressed and acted out that you white people, and the committee was mostly white people, you don't want the client to get something, you in your nice apartment, blah, blah, blah. The supervisor said, listen, I used to be homeless. The building I live in, we don't get hot water sometimes. I have a sense of what you're speaking to. But if we put that client into that building, he does not have the ego skills to handle that. So we need to rage and we need to mourn, but he is not ready for that apartment. That's the kind of work you have to. And you see the systems that you need around you to support that decision and to help you understand your pain. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you so much, Dr. Adams. We're a little bit over time right now. This is due to the interest, thought-provoking conversation and topic that you had. This was really, really wonderful. Thank you so much for your time and your expertise in this. And we will talk soon.
Okay. Thank you all, and keep up the good work you're doing.
Thank you so much.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.